The terrible secret Gerald Levert died with wasn't some wild scandal, wasn't about a woman, and wasn't some double life hidden deep in the music business. It came down to a small orange bottle sitting beside his bed in Cleveland, and years of pain he kept burying just so he could keep performing for everybody. Back in 1987, when Casanova was blasting from every radio and car speaker across America, Gerald finally stepped out from under Eddie Levert's giant shadow. He wasn't just Eddie's son anymore. He was the powerful voice making crowds lose it, the big dude with the smooth sound that could have people emotional by the third row. Then came My Body in 1997 with LSG, and everything changed again. Gerald wasn't trying to follow anybody's path at that point. He became the standard himself, moving through R&B like he owned the whole lane. But behind the fame, the hit records, and the sold-out shows, Gerald was carrying something heavy nobody really talked about. An Achilles surgery left him hurting, his shoulder never fully recovered, and the anxiety kept building in silence, while the industry acted like pain was something artists should just deal with. Over time, that quiet struggle turned into a dangerous secret the Levert family would later spend years trying to understand and explain. Then, on November 10, 2006, at only 40 years old, that secret finally caught up with him inside his own bedroom. Tonight, we're digging into the coroner's report, breaking down the family's emotional statements, and uncovering what really happened to the teddy bear of R&B. And even more shocking, why tragedy hit the Levert family again just 17 months later with his younger brother. But before the prescriptions, before the platinum plaques, and before that freezing Cleveland morning changed everything, there was just a kid from Philadelphia with a legendary last name and a voice he was still learning how to control. July 13, 1966, Gerald Edward Levert entered the world while his father was out touring, chasing the kind of music that would later turn into classics like Backstabbers and Love Train. Eddie Levert wasn't just another singer inside that household. The man had a presence so heavy it filled every room before he even stepped through the door. And whenever he left for another tour, the whole house felt different, almost too quiet. Gerald grew up inside that silence as the oldest son, watching everything closely. By the time the family fully settled in Cleveland, he was already studying his father like other kids studied sports stars. He paid attention to every vocal run, every smooth ad-lib, every tiny way Eddie could stretch a word and make people feel something deep. But being Eddie Levert's son in late 1970s Cleveland came with serious pressure. Everywhere Gerald went, people already knew his last name before he even opened his mouth. And once he started singing, every single note got compared to a living legend. That kind of pressure can crush somebody fast, or it could build a hunger inside him that never stops pushing. For Gerald, it built something powerful. He wasn't trying to be a copy of his father. He wanted his own lane, his own sound, and his own respect in the game.
But 1983, Gerald was 17 years old and rolling with two people who completely understood his vision. First was his younger brother, Sean Levert, only 2 years behind, but already harmonizing so naturally it sounded like music was in his blood from day one. Then there was their close friend, Mark Gordon, a neighborhood kid with the same dream and the same hunger to make it big. Together, the chemistry between them was impossible to ignore. Picture a basement in Cleveland with a cheap 4-track recorder, old floorboards shaking while Backstabbers played upstairs from one of Eddie's records. 3 young black kids stood down there stacking harmonies and building a sound that felt completely different from the OJ's. They called themselves Levert, and everybody already knew that last name could open doors fast. But having the name was only part of the battle. The real question was whether Gerald actually had the voice to stand on his own without hiding behind his father's legacy. He wasn't trying to become another Eddie Levert clone. He was trying to survive being the son of a legend in a music industry that loves tearing down famous kids the second they slip up. Every stage came with whispers, every performance came with side eyes, and people constantly acted like his success had already been handed to him. Every time Gerald grabbed a mic in that basement, he was fighting against the same question he'd heard his whole life. Yeah, but can you really sing? And when he answered, he didn't hold back for anybody. Now picture a recording studio in 1986, the kind of spot where cigarette smoke stayed floating in the air and cold coffee cups covered the control board. Gerald stood at the microphone while Sean and Mark backed him up, working on a synth-heavy R&B track that honestly sounded risky for that time. On paper, it shouldn't have connected the way it did, but the second Gerald opened his mouth, everything changed. His voice hit with confidence, pain, swagger, and soul all at once. That record cracked open the R&B charts, and suddenly radio stations across America started introducing a new name on air. Here's the latest from Levert. But that was only the beginning of the storm they were about to create. The real takeover happened the next year with the big throwdown in a track called Casanova. Everybody knows that record. The bass line walks in like it owns the whole room, and Gerald attacked the hook like he'd been preparing for that exact moment his entire life. During the summer of 1987, you couldn't ride through a black neighborhood anywhere in America without hearing Casanova blasting from somebody's car speakers, apartment window, or corner store radio. And the numbers backed it all up. 4 out of Levert's 5 albums went gold or platinum, turning those 3 kids from a Cleveland basement into major R&B stars almost overnight. One minute, they were experimenting with harmonies on a 4-track recorder, and the next, they were headlining theaters, appearing on Soul Train, opening for huge artists, and quietly becoming the main attraction themselves. Gerald was barely 21 years old, standing on the same stage as his father once dominated. But now, the roles had flipped. Eddie Levert was watching from the sidelines while crowds screamed for his son. That's a rare moment in the music world, especially in R&B, where so many fathers never get to witness their children carry the legacy forward like that. But fame at the end of the 1980s moved fast and hit hard. There wasn't much space to slow down, process emotions, or deal with pressure when the machine kept demanding more records, more shows, and more success every single night. In 1995, Gerald Levert and his father Eddie stepped into the studio together and created Father and Son, a full album built around 2 generations of soul sharing the same microphone. Songs like Wind Beneath My Wings showed something deeper than just music. It showed respect, growth, and a bond that had changed over the years. Think about how powerful that really was. Gerald spent most of his life trying to escape the giant shadow of his father's success. Then one day, instead of running from it, he stood right beside it willingly and sang shoulder to shoulder with the man who inspired him. That album didn't feel like Eddie passing something down out of pity. It felt like 2 grown artists shaking hands as equals. By 1997, Gerald was leveling up all over again. Keith Sweat and Johnny Gill teamed up with him to form LSG, one of the biggest R&B supergroups of the era. 3 lead singers with massive personalities somehow made it work without the drama blowing everything apart. And then came My Body, the smooth, slow-burning anthem that completely took over the Billboard R&B charts. That song became part of the culture fast. If somebody had candles lit and mood music playing in the late 90s, there's a strong chance LSG was coming through those speakers somewhere in the background. Gerald's voice carried confidence, soul, and emotion in a way that made the record impossible to ignore. But Gerald wasn't just focused on singing anymore. He was building an entire empire behind the scenes, too. He wrote songs for other artists, produced records, and helped put groups like the Rude Boys and Men at Large on the map. The Levert name stopped being tied to just one group and started turning into a full R&B brand connected to hit after hit. At the same time, Gerald was stepping into television appearances on shows like The Jamie Foxx Show and The Parkers, expanding his reach beyond music. Whether it was radio, concert stages, TV screens, or album credits, his fingerprints were everywhere in late 1990s R&B. But while the success kept growing, his body was quietly starting to break down. Somewhere between non-stop touring, recording sessions, flights, interviews, and late nights, Gerald's shoulder began hurting in a way that never fully went away. His schedule kept moving even when his body clearly needed rest. And the music business rarely slows down for anybody. In that industry, pain usually gets pushed aside instead of treated properly.
Artists get handed another performance date, another hotel room key, and sometimes another prescription bottle just to keep everything moving. Picture Gerald in 2005 sitting alone between tour stops, maybe on the edge of a hotel bed or inside a dim tour bus, slowly rolling his left shoulder in circles, trying to find one position that didn't send pain shooting through his body. That shoulder pain had been following Gerald for years. Not the kind of soreness that disappears after a little rest either. This was deep, constant pain that builds up after years of singing full force night after night. As the lead vocalist, there was no room for half-effort performances because fans were paying to hear him deliver every note live. Gerald carried that pressure every time he stepped on stage. Then things got even worse when he suffered a torn Achilles tendon. The injury led to surgery, long recovery periods, and time stuck in a walking boot while the music business kept demanding more from him. Even while trying to heal, the questions never stopped coming. When's the next album? When are you touring again? The machine just kept moving. Later on, family spokesperson Andy Gibson explained the situation clearly to the public. Gerald had chronic pain, doctors were treating him, and prescriptions became a part of his everyday routine. Vicodin was prescribed for his shoulder pain. Percocet was added for the Achilles injury. Darvocet entered the picture too, which was common in pain treatment during that era. And when anxiety started creeping into his life on top of the physical pain, there was also a Xanax prescription involved. When you put all of it together, a much different picture starts to appear. The public saw the hit maker, the smooth voice, and the smiling performer on stage. Behind the scenes was a man dealing with constant pain, pressure, and a growing dependence on medications just to keep functioning day after day. Around that same period, Gerald has started dating Kandi Burruss from Escape, the Grammy-winning songwriter who understood the music business inside and out. But more importantly, she seemed to understand Gerald beyond the fame and stage lights. Kandi saw the real man underneath the celebrity image, the version of him most people never got access to. Her daughter Riley was only 6 months old when their relationship began, and during that time, the two quietly recorded a duet together called It's You. What makes the story even crazier is that almost nobody outside their close circle even knew the song existed for nearly 20 years. Two huge R&B names stepped into a studio, created something personal and emotional, then locked it away from the public like it was never meant for the industry at all. That says a lot about where Gerald's mind was during that chapter of his life. In a career where almost everything became public conversation, he still tried holding on to a few private pieces of himself. Maybe that was one of the saddest parts of this whole story. Even while fame kept growing, Gerald still seemed to crave spaces where he could just be human without cameras, headlines, or expectations attached to him.
On the outside, everything still looked solid. He kept making music, kept touring, kept writing songs, and kept delivering the smooth voice people connected to love, heartbreak, and late-night slow jams. Fans saw the polished version of Gerald Levert every time he grabbed a microphone. But behind closed doors, things were becoming heavier. The pain stayed with him. The prescription stayed with him. The anxiety stayed with him too. And most of the time, he carried all of it alone in hotel rooms, backstage areas, tour buses, and eventually inside his own home in Cleveland. Even then, he kept pushing forward like nothing was wrong. But on the morning of November 10th, 2006, Gerald Levert never woke up. When a voice that powerful suddenly goes silent, the shock doesn't fully hit people right away. It takes a moment for reality to settle in. Outside, Cleveland was cold with that gray November weather that makes the whole city feel heavy. Inside the house, Gerald was lying in his own bed, and the situation was already heartbreaking before anyone even crossed the room completely. He was only 40 years old, younger than Eddie Levert had been when he recorded some of the biggest songs of his own legendary career. A father, a son, a brother, then suddenly he was gone. At first, the public got the version of the story that grief sometimes creates when the full truth feels too painful to process. Early reports said Gerald Levert died from a heart attack, and for many people, that explanation felt easier to accept. It fit the image fans had of him, the soulful R&B giant whose heart supposedly gave out after years of pouring emotion into every song. For a while, that became the story people repeated everywhere, and honestly, a lot of fans still believe it today because it sounds less harsh than what actually happened.
But about 3 months later, everything changed. On February 9, 2007, Gwinnett County Coroner Kevin Chartrand stood before reporters with the official findings, and the entire narrative around Gerald's death shifted instantly. The final ruling was accidental acute intoxication. According to the report, Gerald died from a dangerous combination of prescription medications and over-the-counter drugs that slowed and eventually stopped his breathing while he slept. The medications included Vicodin, Percocet, Darvocet, Xanax, and antihistamines. Separately, those drugs were commonly prescribed or purchased, but together, especially inside a body already under stress, the effects became deadly fast. And there was another detail in the autopsy report that didn't get nearly as much attention at the time. Gerald was also dealing with pneumonia when he died. His lungs were already fighting an infection, whether he fully realized it or not. Pneumonia can make breathing harder on its own, but mixed with heavy sedating medications, the danger increases dramatically. His body was struggling on multiple levels at once, even while he kept presenting himself to the world like everything was under control. The tragedy wasn't some reckless Hollywood scandal people could easily point fingers at. It was a complicated mix of chronic pain, medications, exhaustion, illness, and a man trying to keep functioning through all of it until his body simply couldn't anymore. When you add pneumonia to a mix of prescription medications meant for real physical pain and real anxiety, the picture becomes heartbreaking fast. That's the real answer to how a 40-year-old R&B superstar could fall asleep in his own bed and never wake up again. Billboard kept the headline direct: "Accidental drug mix said to kill Levert." Soon after, family spokesperson Andy Gibson faced reporters and tried to explain a situation that was painful and complicated at the same time. Gerald, according to those close to him, wasn't someone secretly partying or spiraling out of control. He was dealing with chronic pain for years while following medical treatment that had been prescribed to him. His shoulder problems were real. The Achilles injury was real. The anxiety was real too. Doctors had given him medications to manage all of it, and every bottle carried his name on the label. That's what makes the story hit so hard. The terrible secret wasn't some hidden scandal or shocking double life waiting to explode in the tabloids. It was much sadder and far more common than people wanted to admit. Gerald Levert died the same way many hard-working people across the country have died over the years, pushing their bodies too far for too long, relying on legal medications to keep functioning, and never realizing how dangerous certain combinations could become. He spent years giving everything he had to music, to touring, to performing, and to meeting expectations that never seemed to slow down. Behind the fame and platinum records was still a man trying to manage pain quietly while continuing to show up for everybody else. That winter, Eddie Levert buried his oldest son. And even through unimaginable grief, the OJs eventually returned to the road because performing was the only life they really knew. The music industry reacted the way it often does: huge tributes, emotional headlines, public tears for a short time, then silence once the cameras moved on. But inside the Levert family, the pain was far from over. Sean Levert, Gerald's younger brother by 2 years, was still trying to process losing the person he'd stood beside almost his entire life. Sean wasn't just family. He was the second voice in the harmonies, the brother who had shared stages, studios, buses, and dreams with Gerald since they were teenagers trying to make it out of Cleveland together.
Now, the stage felt different. Gerald was gone. The harmonies were broken, and Sean Levert was left trying to carry grief while real-life pressure kept crashing down around him. The music didn't stop the bills from coming, and behind the scenes, Sean had been dealing with a long struggle involving unpaid child support. By early 2008, the situation finally caught up with him. Court records showed roughly $89,000 in unpaid support, and a judge ordered him to serve time in the Cuyahoga County Jail. Like Gerald, Sean had also been legally prescribed Xanax for anxiety by a doctor, but when he entered the jail system, that prescription purportedly did not continue with him the way his body had been used to. There was no gradual reduction process, no careful medical transition, and no proper adjustment period for someone who had been relying on the medication consistently.
Within days, Shine's condition purportedly began getting worse. He became disoriented, started hallucinating, and showed serious signs of distress while in custody. People around him could see he was struggling physically and mentally, but the situation kept escalating inside an environment not fully equipped to handle what was happening to him. Then, on March 30th, 2008, tragedy hit the Levert family again. Sean Levert died while restrained inside the county jail, almost exactly 17 months after Gerald's death. He was only 39 years old. Cuyahoga County Coroner Frank Miller later ruled Sean's death as natural causes, connected to several serious health issues, including sarcoidosis, cardiovascular disease, and complications linked to Xanax withdrawal. The ruling sparked heavy public attention and painful questions about medical treatment, incarceration, and whether more could have been done before the situation turned fatal. For the Levert family, it became another devastating chapter in a story already filled with unimaginable loss. Natural causes. That's what the official paperwork said at first glance, clean and simple on the surface. But inside the Levert family, that explanation never fully sat right. The questions lingered. The details felt heavier than the label suggested. And eventually, a jury would side with the family's concerns, awarding the estate around $4 million in a wrongful death settlement tied to what happened and what failed to happen inside those jail walls. Now, think about Eddie Levert for a moment. One of the most powerful voices in soul music history, a man who helped turn the OJs into a cultural institution. And yet, within just 17 months, he had to stand at 2 separate gravesides and bury both of his sons. There was no lyric strong enough for that, no stage performance that can carry that kind of weight without breaking something inside you. Still, Eddie kept performing. He kept touring because for a legend like him, the show doesn't pause just because life collapses behind the curtain. But after everything, every time he sang "Wind Beneath My Wings," it wasn't just a performance anymore. It felt like a conversation with absence itself, like a duet with voices that were no longer physically there, but still echoing in his world. For a while after 2008, the Levert name slowly faded from mainstream conversation. Gerald's music stayed alive on Quiet Storm radio stations, played consistently the way black radio preserves its own history, keeping those smooth ballads in rotation like they never left the room. Outside of that space, the industry moved on. Entertainment blogs shifted focus, headlines changed, and the story of 2 brothers lost within 17 months began slipping into that quiet category reserved for black music legends that America stops actively talking about. Not erased, but no longer centered. Still, a voice like Gerald's doesn't just vanish because the headlines move on. It lingers. Years later, in August 2012, TV One opened an episode of Unsung, and suddenly the story came back into focus. For a full hour, the narrative was told differently, this time through family eyes. Eddie spoke about his sons. Gerald's daughter, Carlicia, spoke about her father. Archival footage of Levert performances played across screens, pulling memories back into living rooms from Cleveland to Compton, reminding everyone that the story never really ended. It just paused in silence. For an entire generation of R&B fans who grew up hearing Casanova and My Body blasting through speakers without really knowing the man behind that voice, the Unsung episode became the closest thing to a mainstream eulogy Gerald Levert ever received. It pulled the curtain back and forced people to sit with the real story, not just the polished radio version. Behind the scenes, the preservation of Gerald's legacy didn't stop there. In June 2022, 16 years after his passing, Candy Burris made a decision that brought another layer of his story back into public view. She went back into archived recordings and recovered a track she and Gerald had recorded during their private relationship in 2003. That track, It's You, was finally released to the world. A love song created in a quiet moment, shared now with an audience he was no longer here to hear it with. Candy also spoke openly about their relationship on The Real Housewives of Atlanta, confirming timelines, emotions, and the depth of their connection. It reshaped how some fans view Gerald, showing a more personal side of the teddy bear of R&B that had always been hinted at through his music, but rarely fully understood. By 2025, the digital documentary wave had fully caught up with Gerald Levert's legacy. Full-length documentaries began appearing across legacy music platforms and YouTube channels, revisiting his rise, his impact, and the complicated reality behind his success. His story was being re-examined again, this time with more detail, more honesty, and a growing recognition that his influence on R&B never really faded. It just evolved into a deeper kind of legacy over time.
Black legend tribute pages started flooding timelines with posts, clips, and throwback edits honoring Gerald Levert. A whole new generation that wasn't even born when Casanova first hit radio waves began discovering him through TikTok snippets, slow jam playlists, Bluetooth speakers in their parents' cars, and those classic cookout mixes that always seem to carry timeless R&B. Meanwhile, Quiet Storm Radio never stopped playing him in the background like he never left the rotation in the first place. They were just waiting for the rest of the internet to catch up. That's the real thing about Gerald's legacy. It never needed a comeback because it never actually disappeared. It simply shifted form. From Billboard charts to memory, from radio playlists to the bloodstream of Black American music itself. You can still hear his influence in the way Jaheim stretches a phrase, and the way Tank leans into a falsetto, and in the emotional delivery that defines modern R&B vocalists. And every time Eddie Levert steps onto an OJ's stage and sings "Wind Beneath My Wings" with his eyes closed, the audience already knows exactly what that moment carries. That song is no longer just a performance. It feels like a conversation with absence itself. Fast forward to 2026, somewhere on an OJ's tour stop, maybe a Detroit theater or an Atlantic City casino ballroom where the lights still hit warm and the crowd still knows every word. Eddie is in his 80s now, still showing up, still performing, still carrying a name that once belonged to 3 men and now rests mostly on his shoulders alone. And somewhere in that set list, he sings a song he once shared with Gerald. For a few minutes, the entire room shifts. It stops feeling like a concert and starts feeling like a memory you can walk through. That's the first thing Gerald left behind, music that can bend time like that. He also left behind a blueprint. Father and Son still stands as the gold standard for what happens when a parent and child meet in the studio with real love and matched voices, no ego getting in the way. Every time an R&B legacy child records with a famous parent, whether they admit it or not, they're being compared to what Gerald and Eddie created in that booth more than 30 years ago. Then there's the catalog itself: Casanova, Baby, Hold On to Me, My Body, Private Line, songs that didn't need algorithms or trends to survive because the audience never stopped returning to them. They still show up at weddings, still surface in breakup playlists, still play in barbershops on Saturday afternoons and kitchens on Sunday mornings. And then there's the harder inheritance, the quieter truths. Sean's story and the $4 million wrongful death judgment became a part of a larger conversation about Black men, prescription medication, and what can happen inside the American correctional system when care fails at the wrong moment. Gerald's own story became a cautionary reflection on working musicians, chronic pain, and an industry that often treats human bodies like replaceable equipment instead of fragile systems that need care. Neither of those lessons ever got the same spotlight as his hits, but the people who needed to understand them did. So when you add it all up, Gerald Levert was never just the son of a legend. He was a voice that built his own lane, carried his own weight, and left behind something that still echoes long after the music stops. He started as a frontman, then rose into a solo star, then stepped into supergroups, then expanded into producing records behind the scenes, and eventually became something the industry still hasn't fully made peace with, a cautionary tale wrapped inside legendary R&B success. He was dealing with a shoulder that never stopped hurting, an Achilles injury that changed how he moved, anxiety that required medical treatment, and still, a voice that could silence a whole room full of people in seconds.
Gerald Levert was only 40 years old when he passed away in his own bed in Cleveland, and the hardest truth behind his story wasn't some shocking scandal or hidden double life. It was something far more ordinary and far more painful. His body had been asking for rest for years, and the industry around him never really gave it the space to slow down. He didn't die from a secret lifestyle or some dramatic revelation. He died from a life that kept moving too fast for too long, and that reality says something heavy about the pressure placed on working black artists who are expected to keep performing no matter what it costs them. Rest easy, teddy bear. The music is still here, and your voice is still in it. If this story moved you, make sure to like, subscribe, share, and drop a comment below. Let us know what Gerald Levert's music meant to you and where you first heard his voice.